I caught my thief in a single phone call. Ma'am, we've matched the fingerprints on your jewelry box and you'll want to sit down. When the detective said my son's name, the room tilted, my breath thinned, and I understood that the worst betrayal of my 70 years had been committed by the boy I taught to tie his shoes. That was not the last shock. 2 months later, he would hand me every heirloom back along with the deed to his own home, lost and gone because of what he'd done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Dorothy, I'm 69, and I had a ritual that never once felt old. Every Sunday after church, I'd make tea, lay a velvet tray on my dining table, and take one piece from the safe to wear while I baked. A cuff. A brooch. A ring that once held my grandmother's knuckle as she crossed railroad tracks with me, humming over the noise. Our family doesn't pray to gold, but our history sleeps in it. That afternoon it was drizzling, the kind of rain that makes the peonies look grateful. I had slipped on the opal ring oval stone, fire that moved like a kept secret, and I wore it while I cooled lemon bars on wire racks. After supper, I carried the ring back to the safe in my bedroom closet. I turned the dial, listening for the little clicks the way a pianist knows when a chord settles into itself. The door opened to nothing. Not misplacement. Not disorder. An emptiness so complete it had edges. The black velvet shelves, usually busy with color, garnet glow, pearl moon, a raucous echo of my mother's laugh caught in a bracelet, were stripped bare. The tray at the bottom had a single phantom impression where the necklace used to sit like a sleeping cat. The smell inside the safe was wrong too, not the faint perfume of old wood and metal, but colder, like someone else's breath had been here. I didn't scream. I went hollow from the inside out. My hands shook the way branches tremble when a train goes by. I put the opal ring on the dresser and tried to count, as if numbers could pull me back. 1 heirloom per child per generation. That was our rule. My grandmother's pearls, my mother's wedding brooch, the sapphire drop that came over from Ireland tucked into a heel. The ruby that my husband, God rest him, saved 3 winters to buy me because he said red made me look dangerous in a way that thrilled him. All of it gone. There's panic, and then there's panic's cousin, the one that arrives with manners and a clipboard. I found the bottle in the nightstand, the sedative my doctor prescribed after my husband's funeral, and I took one with a shake of cold water, but I could not feel it do anything. I dialed 911. The patrol officers were kind, the way people are kind when they think age has made you breakable. They asked me to walk them through who knew the combination. Only me. When I had my pacemaker surgery last year, I taped the numbers under the closet shelf in case the worst happened. I checked, the tape had been lifted and pressed back down. It felt like the solution to a cruel riddle. The thief knew me well enough to know where I would leave myself a lifeline. Family, one officer asked, as gently as anyone has ever asked a question that could split a life in half. My son's the only one who comes and goes, I said. But I can't, he wouldn't. The sentence collapsed under its own weight, and the officer let it die on the carpet between us. They dusted. They took photos under a flash that made everything look like a bad dream. They asked for lists, appraisals, descriptions. I had what they needed because my husband and I kept our papers in a red accordion file labeled, in his penciled block letters, things we love and things we owe. I sat at the dining table while the rain slowed and the daylight turned to a thin gray ribbon and wrote the names of everything I could remember. Grandmother's pearls, clasp shaped like a leaf, tiny dent near the hinge from when I caught it on a sweater as a girl. Mother's brooch with the cornflower sapphire at the center, great-grandfather's pocket watch chain, the ruby, the Art Deco bracelet with the diamond rose that squeaked a little when you shook it like a line of mice in shoes. The detective came Monday. She wore a wool coat that looked too warm for March, and she told me thieves move heirlooms fast, estate buyers, pawn counters, social media groups where estate is a synonym for desperation. She said we had a chance if the pieces were distinctive. I showed her photos of me wearing them. Weddings. Christenings. The time we watched fireworks by the river and the bracelet caught every color like it was applauding. Serial numbers? She asked. On the watch and one of the bracelet clasps, I said. And I micro-etched 3 pieces after a friend lost hers to a home aide who turned out not to be. Tiny initials on the underside. Her eyebrows lifted. That will help. That night I didn't sleep. I made tea at 2 in the morning and stared at the safe until the quiet made me dizzy. I tried to rehear every word my son had said lately, fishing in memory for anything bent out of shape. He's 42, that age where men think they can fix a life with a single bold move. He'd been talking about a business. Not talking, pitching. The kind of voice he used as a boy when he thought charm could stack the blocks higher. "Mom, come on," he'd said over meatloaf 2 weeks earlier, napkins slung like an afterthought. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime deal. The club is already popular. It just needs new management. I've got an investor willing to cover the liquor license, but the closing costs are killing me. If I can bridge that, I'll be liquid by summer. I can even buy back anything I borrow." "You're not borrowing from me," I'd told him. "I don't loan what I can't afford to give, and I won't give what belongs to your grandparents. Nightclubs burn money even when they're well run. You have never run anything well." He smiled like he was 5 again and had just been told Santa knew everything. "That's harsh, Mom." "It's true," I said, and we let the truth sit between us like a glass of water no one wanted to claim. I wanted to believe that conversation would be enough. I wanted to believe I still had the kind of voice a son can't ignore. But on Tuesday the detective called to say they had footage. A man in a cap, broad shoulders, I know the shape of the way you know your own handwriting, selling a family's past to a stranger over a glass case. The shop owner had taken a copy of the man's license, another policy, meant to catch amateurs. The name on the license was my son's. When they said it, I had to press my palm flat to the wall. Vertigo. Heat under the skin like I'd been standing too close to a radiator. "Do you want to come down and make a statement?" the detective asked. "I want you to find my things," I said, and my voice sounded like it came from the part of me that survived my husband's last winter. "And yes, I'll make whatever statement you need." At the precinct, the walls were that institutional eggshell that absorbs hope. A second detective with a face like a closed fist asked if I wanted to press charges. The first detective put a hand on my forearm, light, there and gone. "You don't have to decide today," she said. "Decisions are how we keep names from being erased," I said before I could stop myself. He took more than gold. He took proof of the people who loved me. They found him by dinner. The pawnbroker recognized the bracelet on an online bulletin the police circulated. "Good man, that broker, sharp in spite of a world that must always be trying to dull you." He called it in. They picked my son up behind the club he apparently now co-owned, a neon place with a name that sounded like either a promise or a dare. When they called to tell me, I put the phone down gently, stood in the kitchen where I had taught that boy fractions by cutting brownies, and cried without making a single sound. Mourning is not just for the dead. He didn't ask me for a lawyer. He asked for me. This is the part some people will question. Why did I go? Because I am a mother, and because not going would have meant that the last time I looked into my son's face I was still pretending everything was fine. I put on my coat, the one with the deep inside pocket where I keep old grocery lists and church bulletins, and I went to the station with my spine as straight as I could make it. He looked older in the interview room. Not old as in years, old as in used. Skin slack from not enough good sleep. The confidence on him like a jacket that didn't quite fit. "Mom," he said, voice too bright, a boy trying to joke his way past a broken vase. "You look nice." The detective said you wanted to talk. He told his story like it would sound better spoken out loud. The shortcut with the club. The investors who suddenly needed money cleared by Friday. The plan to hold the jewelry for a week, sell it, buy the club, triple his cash in a month, buy everything back good as new. He used the word flip, like he was talking about houses or pancakes. "You stole from me," I said, because sometimes a sentence has to be sanded down until it is only wood and grain and the truth you can run your fingers over. "I borrowed with intention," he shot back too fast, and then flinched at his own choice of words. "How much did you get?" He named a number. A third of what the pieces were worth even on a bad day, less than a sixth if anyone had bothered to care about their stories. "Why so low?" "Because speed costs," he said, and for 1 second his face was naked with shame. "Because I had to move them fast." "Because I thought," he looked away. "I thought I had time, Mom. I thought I could fix it before you ever knew. Before I ever opened my safe again," I said. "Before I ever put my grandmother back to bed." He rubbed his face. You always make things sound poetic when they're just human, I said. Stealing a grandmother is not poetic. It is human ruin. The detectives let us sit. I think they understood that there is law and there is mother law, and the latter must be witnessed if anyone hopes to live with what comes next. What do you want me to do? He asked finally, and I heard the boy in him, the one who used to look at me like I had a recipe for every mess that could be made in a kitchen. You'll return every single piece, I said. You'll mortgage your house if you must. You'll call every buyer and offer more than you got to get them back. You'll live in a room above that club with a mattress on the floor and a notebook of names and numbers until you can hand me everything that belongs to me and my dead. If you miss one piece, you miss them all. And if you fail, I will press charges and I will not regret it. I will set aside the part of me that changed your diapers, and I will look only at the woman who owes her dead fairness. He swallowed. I can't get them all back in time. You will, I said. Because time is not kind to remorse. Because a month from now the bracelet will have been broken down into stones. Because by fall someone's bride will be wearing my mother's brooch with our name filed off. You have 60 days. The detective will lend you a list of who bought what. I will call the ones who need a grandmother's voice to make the price right. He put his hands over his face. When he dropped them, the confidence jacket was gone. 60 days, he said. I'll do it. I'll mortgage the house. I'll sell the car. You will also get a licensed electrician to bring that club into code, I said, because even middle of catastrophe, a mother sees the other disaster brewing. I had walked past the back alley once, seen extension cords like ivy, outlets groaning. If you are going to gamble with your life, do not gamble with other people's lives. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me as if he had just realized I was still telling the truth even when it hurt him. We set terms with the detectives. He would be charged, but the DA would consider a diversion if the property was returned in full. He would surrender his passport and check in twice a week so that the state knew remorse hadn't pulled up stakes and run. He signed papers. I signed with a hand that didn't quite feel like mine. He stared at the tabletop like it might teach him new math. He began the next morning. I know because by 9, he had texted me 3 receipts and a photo of the opal ring sitting in the palm of his hand. I didn't reply. I took my wheeled cart to the grocery instead, bought green beans and serviceable coffee and the kind of bread that toasts well and feeds a woman who can't taste much anyway. When I got home, I put the ring back where it belonged and sat in the quiet for an hour listening to the house realize it had one of its hearts back. If the story had ended there, it would have been just a story about theft and a mother's temper dressed up as justice. But life likes its ironies, and my son likes his shortcuts. 10 days into his hunt, the club announced a grand reopening under new management. He had closed his deal. He had bought the black box with the pink neon and the smoke machine, and he had not hired a real electrician. He had hired a friend with a pair of pliers and optimism. The night it burned, the sky on our side of town went the color of copper. From my porch, I watched a column of smoke lean toward the river. I smelled the sour electrical burn that coats the back of your tongue. No lives were lost, bless every miracle that can still be coaxed from a bad decision, but the damage was total. The next day the insurance company, cold as algebra, said the words no one running on hope wants to hear: negligence, code violations, claim denied. The club was a hole with wet brick teeth. My son was a man with a handful of receipts and a stack of debts, and the 60-day clock was still running. He did not ask me to change the terms. He sold the car. He listed the house. He slept on a friend's sofa when the mattress over the club smelled too much like smoke to be endured. He called buyers who laughed cruelly, buyers who wept and offered a discount because they had mothers, buyers who pretended not to understand the word heirloom until he added another 0. I asked the detective for a copy of the list and I started making calls too. A grandmother's voice does things to a person's pride. That pendant, I said to a woman in Tulsa who had moved here 15 years ago and was trying to make our state home. It looks like a bargain until you understand that it carries my mother's bent for forgiveness and my husband's perfect patience on Sunday mornings. You give it back and you'll sleep better your first night than you have in a year. She sent it overnight. Other calls were less merciful. A jeweler upstate wanted double. A man with a voice like a locked door taunted me for thinking names mattered. I kept dialing anyway. At the end of each day, my son and I would text a single tally to each other. 3 back today. 2 back today. None, but not giving up. In between those numbers, I said nothing. He owed me silence to work in. 3 weeks in, I took the empty velvet trays from the safe and laid them out on the dining table, one for each line of the family. I placed the pieces we had recovered in the grooves where they used to lie. The table looked like an old map being repopulated after a war. My grandmother's pearls found their space again next to my mother's brooch. The ruby did not come home until week 5, and when it did, I held it in my fist so tight the facets dented my palm. I didn't mind. Some marks are better than lotion for a woman's hand. The last week measured itself in breath. He texted 27 of 31, then again 29, then a day later, late at night, a face-up photo of the Art Deco bracelet flashing under a diner's fluorescent lights. Had to meet him after he closed, he typed. He made me say why it mattered. I told him about the mice in shoes. You remembered, I wrote, the first extra words I had allowed either of us. I am remembering a lot of things, he wrote back. He did not add, like electricity codes and the cost of haste. He did not need to. The club's skeleton rose black against daylight every time he drove by. Consequences had built their own monument. On day 59, he rang my bell just before sunset. He looked hungry and alert in the same way a man looks at the end of a long hike when the last summit is in view. He took off his cap in the hallway like a boy taught to mind his manners entering a church. He laid a small suede pouch on my table and opened it with hands that had learned to be careful again. The final piece was my great-grandfather's watch chain. It had a nick near the clasp where a little girl once gnawed at it during a funeral because she didn't know how else to tell her mouth to stop shaking. It was the hardest, he said. He didn't want to sell it back. Said it was meant to be worn. I told him I agreed. I told him my grandmother needed to wear it in her memory. He said grandmothers don't wear watch chains. I said you do. I do, I said softly, and put my husband's watch, found on day 23, on the chain, and let the weight of history settle into my palm. We stood like that for a moment, the ordinary holiness of objects restored. Then he reached into his jacket and took out a manila envelope, neat, bowed at the corners, over full. He slid it across the table as if it were a bill he was ashamed to hand me. What is this? I asked, though I already understood the shape of it. Papers for the house, he said. It's sold yesterday. I paid the last man for the chain in cash this morning. I didn't want to come home without it. I opened the envelope and saw my son's signature echoing my own across pages that transfer a life from one person to another. Loss has its paperwork. So does restitution. You've lost your home, I said. And I returned yours, he said, and for the first time since the safe gaped at me like an accusation, I saw the exact boy I had raised. The one who had once walked back to a grocery across 2 parking lots because we had been given too much change and the world had to be corrected, even if we were only 7 minutes late to soccer practice. Sit, I said, and he did. I made tea and we drank it like a sacrament. This is where many stories end. Property returned, a son chastened, a mother's anger cooling into a lesson everyone will tell as a warning at weddings. But our ending had another turn still in it, the one that gave me the satisfaction I didn't know I needed. It began the day after the jewelry came home, when I took a bus across town to stand at the black mouth of what used to be his club. The ash smell had thinned, but not vanished. Somebody had sprayed a small, neat heart on a surviving wall and the city had not yet bothered to paint it away. You think you know the ending, he pays, I forgive. But this was not about mercy alone. This was about making something clean out of something scorched. And so I reached into my purse, touched a velvet pouch for strength, and began to plan what I would do next with every returned piece, every paper in that envelope, every ounce of authority I still had over my name. By noon I owned the ashes of my son's nightclub. By midnight I had the signature of the man who told him to cheat. That wasn't mercy. That was architecture. Build the truth one joist at a time, bolt it to paper, and make sure it stands when wind hits it. The morning after he brought the last piece home, I took a city bus to the block where the air still smelled faintly of pennies and wet plaster. The club's sign had slumped. A pink cursive O snapped in the middle like a broken promise. Yellow tape flapped where the front door should have been, and the wall that hadn't fallen wore a fire's fingerprint in scalloped black. A young woman in a hard hat was chalking an X on the brick. "You can't go in," she called without looking up. "I know," I said, and gave her the kind of smile you bring to a potluck when you've made your best dish. "But I can stand here and listen." She smiled back in spite of herself. "You're not press, are you?" "I'm not. I'm the mother." Her eyebrows climbed. "Oh," she said softly, the way people say oh when the headline drops its voice and becomes a story told at a kitchen table. "I bartended here sometimes. Rena." We tried to keep the crowd safe, but the power would hiccup when the DJ hit the lights. "The power hiccuped," I repeated, rolling the word in my mouth like a marble. "And the exits?" "Blocked the night of the fire," she said, voice tightening. "Storage creeping where it shouldn't, like ivy. We cleared them, but not fast enough to keep the smoke from eating your lungs." She touched her throat like memory had left a smudge there. "Thank you," I said. "You were brave." She shrugged, embarrassed. "We were lucky," she said. "Could have been worse." I walked around to the alley. The back door had shrugged its hinges like a coat it didn't want to wear anymore. On the concrete, a melted cord lay fossilized into a snaking, blackened line. I knelt, pressed my fingers to the cold, and promised out loud to the empty air, "We are going to fix everything that can be fixed, and we are going to name what cannot." At City Hall, I signed a form the color of a bruise: public records request, fire report, permit history, inspection notes. The clerk stamped it with a thud that said, "Now you belong to the process." I sat on a bench under a painting of a river no one fished anymore and waited while the building seemed to breathe around me, paper in, paper out, lives crossing counters like coins. The reports arrived in a manila envelope, still warm from the copier. I spread the papers out on a table in the lobby and read like I was learning a new language. Cause of origin: electrical failure at ceiling level junction, bathroom corridor, evidence of improper pigtailing, non-compliant wire gauge, heat striation patterns consistent with overloading and arcing. I read it twice, then a third time with my finger under each clause like I was a first grader in an old primer. In the permit file, a neat row of boxes had been checked: demolition, no; structural, no; plumbing, no; electrical, rough-in, yes; electrical, final, pending. The final was stamped deferred, then in pen, days later than the fire, a tidy initial and a rubber stamp for temporary occupancy no human had signed in ink. I traced the initial with my nail. It wasn't the fire marshal's hand. It wasn't the city inspector's. It was a consultant's stamp, third party, allowed only when the city is backed up and only for limited use. In the margin, a note that read, "Owner requested expedited reopening to meet investor obligations." Owner, my son. Obligations, the men who taught him that speed is a god and safety a rumor. I asked the clerk who held the contract for third-party inspections. She wrote down a company name and a number with a pencil that had been sharpened to a dangerous point. "You can call," she said. "They're not supposed to be issuing occupancy by themselves." I thanked her and went to the pawn of the day, the landlord. He was a man with a tidy beard and the look of someone who had once blended smoothies for a living. He wore a sweatshirt with the neighborhood name on it, which told me everything about his relationship to the neighborhood. "No one has paid rent since the fire," he said. "And the lease says tenant responsible for code compliance. We're void." "I'm not here to argue that," I said. "I'm here to buy your headache." I pulled a folder from my tote, crisp, labeled, "The way my husband liked his arguments. Quitclaim me your interest in fixtures and salvage for $1 and my promise to shoulder cleanup until the city gives you back your appetite." He blinked. "Why would you want?" "Because grief is heavy until it becomes an object," I said. "Then it's something you can pick up and move." He looked at my face the way men do when they realize they are talking to a woman who has already lived through the singular worst day of her life and come out with a plan anyway. He signed. I paid my $1, a real one, not a check, not a joke, and we shook on it, both aware that sometimes dignity is exactly 4 quarters and a poor pen. By noon I owned the ashes. I called the inspector of record next. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Ma'am, I never released occupancy. Somebody stamped something they shouldn't have." "Consultant," I said, and read him the initials. He sighed like a radiator cooling. "They know better. Do me a favor, put everything in a letter, certified. Copy to the mayor's office, the DA's consumer fraud unit, and the insurer on that property. If there's a pattern, it'll shake. If there isn't, this still gets fixed." I went home and wrote a grandmother's letter with a paralegal spine. Facts, dates, copies of the pages with the little lies on them. I used the words I knew could not be fluffed away: falsified reliance, negligent misrepresentation, unsafe occupancy. I wrote in ink because ink is a promise and a threat both. Then I called the consultant. "I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," I said, and listened to his cheerful hold music while he went to check a file. When he came back to the phone, the cheer was gone. "We don't authorize," he said quickly. "We only recommend. If a stamp ended up on a door," I finished, "before a fire. After the city said no. That would be a mistake," he said. "We agree," I said. "Do you want to sign a correction letter today or when the DA calls?" Silence. The hum of a copier in the background, the soft shush of somebody else's papers being turned. "I can draft something," he said finally. "Tonight," I said. "Before midnight." He did. He emailed me a letter on his letterhead, signed with a tidy digital signature that told me he had done this before, but never under the eye of someone's mother. It stated, in the kinds of words insurance companies love, that no final occupancy had been approved by his firm, that any temporary signage was advisory only, that any reliance was improper and a misapplication of the scope of the contract. It named names. It had dates. By midnight, I had the man's signature who told my son to cheat. Now came the investor. My son had only ever called him Vega, as if he were a star. I found him in a steakhouse booth at 5 in the afternoon because people who move other people's money like to sit early and call it a head start. He wore a sport coat and a watch big enough to time a race. "Mrs. Just Dorothy," I said, taking the seat across from him like it belonged to me. "You told my son to open fast or lose your money." "I told your son to execute," he corrected smoothly. "Time kills deals. Time kills people when exits are blocked and wires are wrong," I said. "Here is the fire report. Here is the permit that wasn't. Here is the letter from the consultant who says you used their stamp like a hall pass." He put 2 fingers to the papers as if he could stop their contents with touch alone. "What do you want?" he asked. "The truth," I said. "Signed. Dated. On a napkin if you like, but I brought better paper." He laughed, wrong-footed by the old woman who didn't bring tears. I clicked my pen and set it on the table between us. He looked at my face and understood the math, write now or be written later by someone with a badge. He wrote a paragraph that said everything in a way that would satisfy a jury without boring them. He admitted to pressuring for opening. He admitted to promising to cover code work after cash flow stabilized. He admitted that he told my son, in plain words, the city isn't going to care if they see progress. He initialed each line like we were buying a refrigerator. I slid the paper into a plastic sleeve and stood. "Thank you for your cooperation," I said. "Are you going to sue me?" he asked. "I don't prefer it," I said. "I prefer oxygen, working exit signs, and club lights that don't try to fry a person's hair from the scalp. But if a suit is what it takes to teach a man to stop setting matches near other people's lives, then yes, I will." He didn't smile when I left. He looked at his hands as if they had just betrayed him by writing the truth. That night I assembled a package on my dining table like I was preparing communion. Fire report, permit records, consultant letter, investor statement, receipts for the jewelry buybacks my son had sweated out one phone call at a time. I addressed one envelope to the insurance company with a cover letter that used their own policy language back at them like a mirror. I addressed another to the DA. I made a third for the city's risk manager and a fourth for the landlord so he could sleep easier knowing he had been fooled too, and now we would all be unfooled together. I slept. Not long, but clean. I dreamed of my grandmother's pearls cooling in water while I rinsed lemon zest from my fingers. We do not always get satisfying turns, but the next week handed them out like favors. The insurer called to say they wouldn't pay the claim to my son. Negligence is negligence, but they would be opening a subrogation action against the consultant and the investor for contributing cause. The city called to say they had suspended the consultant's right to stamp anything until their review concluded. The DA sent a polite letter asking for a recorded statement. The landlord called me to ask what he should say to a journalist. Say the truth, I told him. Say speed is a ladder missing rungs. My son moved into my guest room with a duffel bag and the tired walk of a man who finally knows how far the distance is between a plan and a day. We wrote rules on an index card and stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a rooster. Clean up after yourself. Call before late nights. No talk about money after 9. Quick update at breakfast like we are colleagues in a decent office. He nodded. He was learning to nod. Mom, he said on the third breakfast, hands wrapped around his coffee like it might warm his bones from inside. You bought the ashes. I did. Why? Because nothing teaches like an object you have to move with your hands, I said. You will help me clear it. You will document it, code by code, with a licensed demolition crew beside you. You will pay attention. You will never again let a wire pretend to be a root. He swallowed. What are we rebuilding? First, a lesson, I said. Then a room where people can dance without worrying about the roof. Sunday afternoons for families. Weeknights for teens who need a place to learn what sound can do besides hurt your ears. Quiet mornings for a grief group that doesn't want to sit on folding chairs in a church basement because their dead deserve windows. He stared at me like I was telling him there was still a year after December. What would we call it? The Sunday room, I said. And downstairs, a little gallery for the collection. Not to show off. To teach. A map of our people in metal and light. You'd let them out, he asked, glancing at the safe in the corner of his eye like it was a dragon, and he had just learned the dragon had a door. For a few hours at a time, I said, smiling because I let myself. In cases bolted to the wall. With guards named Mary and Tom who trained at the church fish fry and know how to stare a hand back into its pocket. He laughed, and it was the first sound he'd made in months that wasn't taped at the edges with apology. We started with a list of fire lieutenant handed me on a clipboard at the site. Salvageable, unsafe, hazardous, sentimental. We weren't allowed inside yet, but we could plan. I hired a contractor who had hands like a mason and a fondness for rules. He brought an electrician named Alma who spoke about voltage the way a gardener talks about rain, respect, gratitude, boundaries. She walked the perimeter with my son and taught him to look at walls like he could hear the future through them. See that sip pattern, she said, pointing with her pencil. It tells you where the heat licked first. Follow the licks and you'll find the sin. The what? My son asked. The part someone did wrong, she said easily. We call it the sin because it's a choice, even if the person who chose didn't mean harm. Cheaper wire is a choice. Overloaded breaker is a choice. Ignoring a code because you're tired is a choice. Fire doesn't care about your reasons. Fire only reads the math. He nodded like he would remember it the way some men remember lullabies. When the city finally let us inside, I wore my oldest boots and my husband's leather gloves. The floor crunched underfoot like stale cereal. In the corner where the DJ booth had been, a mirror had silvered and then surrendered. It hung like a hurt moon. I picked up a charred length of something that had once pretended to be a proper junction and held it out so my son could see the lie. The wire inside was a size too small. The insulation bubbled back, a bite taken out of a rule. Photo, Alma said, and he took one with the city placard in the frame so the picture would count later. We filled a dumpster with anything that would cut a hand. We set aside a pile labeled, hopefully, reuse, intact brick, a length of iron stair that had kept its integrity, a mirror frame that might look like redemption with fresh glass. I found the pink O from the sign buried in ash like a candy turned serious. I had the crew carry it to the truck like a saint on a platform. We put the sign in my garage, and Alma ran a new line on a separate circuit with a little surge protector like a chaperone. When we first plugged it in, the O glowed, not bright like it had once bullied the night, but soft like dawn. I stood under it and felt the kind of satisfaction that doesn't look loud on a person but draws lines around their eyes like someone has been smiling even when no one was watching. The papers began to move. The DA called to schedule interviews with the consultant and Vega. The insurer's subrogation team wanted my photos. The city held a hearing on consultant misuse. I brought Rena, who spoke into a microphone with a bartender's forthrightness. "You can't buy speed with staff lungs," she said, and I watched 2 council members sit up straighter. For myself, I began an exhibit at my dining table, folding cards with names, dates, and small stories. Pearls, worn by Maureen on the day sailors came home. Ruby, bought after we paid off the car, he said red made me look brave. Watch chain, nicked at my grandfather's funeral by a child who didn't know where else to put her fear. The cards stood like small headstones, but they didn't make me sad. They made me focused. A history told is a history saved. We held our first salvage sale a month after I bought the ashes. We announced it with handwritten signs taped to telephone poles and an email Rena sent to everyone who had ever tipped her well. Proceeds to clean up, the sign said. Future community room, not another club. People came like rain finds a downspout, quietly, steadily, with direction. A man bought a stack of unbroken plates for his restaurant. A teenager begged for the metal stool from the coat check and promised to repaint it green. A woman in a red coat brought a set of tools and traded a half-day of labor for the mirror frame. I traded back an extra plate I found under the rubble because her hands were full and she'd said something kind to my son when she didn't have to. Neighbors asked for updates like we were a show, but we weren't. We were penance learning to be useful. My son worked at night delivering groceries with a borrowed hatchback and spent days hauling, sweeping, photographing, and learning why codes exist. He kept a notebook. On one page he'd written, "Don't save $30 to spend a life." On another, "Call Alma before plugging anything in." In the back pocket, a folded paper, the paragraph Vega wrote in a steakhouse booth, worn where his thumb worried its corner whenever a person tried to talk him into a shortcut. He would hold it up like a badge. "Read this. Then tell me about speed." "Do you hate me?" he asked, one night weeding the cracks in my driveway because the way back to dignity is strangely full of knees on gravel. "I don't," I said. "I don't trust your shortcuts, and I don't plan to. But every day you do an honest thing is a day my trust grows a root." He nodded at the ground like he could see it, the underground network starting to happen. When the city scheduled the consultant hearing, the room filled with people who had once signed without understanding and people who had caught themselves at the edge of understanding and stopped anyway. The consultant's lawyer spoke about backlog, about pressure, about significant ambiguity in the language. The city's investigator spoke about photos, about stamps out of sequence, about a pattern like a knitting mistake repeated across a sweater. When it was my turn, I brought the watch chain. I held it up like a teacher holds up an example sentence. "This nick," I said, "happened because a child didn't know what to do with grief. This fire happened because adults pretended not to know what to do with rules. You will decide whether we teach people here that temporary stamps can be used like lubricants or whether we teach them they're a promise that the real inspection is coming. I am only asking that the next mother's jewels not be carried through a crowd toward a pawn counter while her son believes he has time to make it right. It is not the job of a grandmother to make lawmakers cry," but one of them put his hand to his eyes with a small, embarrassed smile, the kind men make when they realize the right thing will be recorded next to their name. After the hearing, Vega called me from a number I didn't know. "You climbed into the ring," he said, trying and failing to sound amused. "I stood in a room and told the truth in a way that people could hear it," I said. "A ring is for punching. This is for building. What do you want to make this go away?" I looked around my kitchen at the folding cards, the photos taped to the cupboard, the pink O humming in the garage like a pet we were keeping for a friend. "It doesn't go away," I said. "But you can help it go forward. Write checks to the safety classes Rena is organizing. Fund a small business grant for code-compliant upgrades in every bar that shows you their electrical panel and their permit. Put your name on it if you must. But when you sleep, let it be the last name you ever want to see written next to the word expedite." "Is that a threat?" "It's a list," I said, "of ways to be the man you might have been if someone had made you stack chairs in a church hall when you were 19. He hung up because men like him are not built to be told they have options that look like work. We filed the civil suit a week later, not because I wanted a courtroom but because I wanted a discovery phase, emails, texts, records that show a scheme or a sloppiness so consistent it becomes indistinguishable from intent. My attorney was a woman with a braid like a rope. She read my file and said, "You already did half my job." We shook hands and agreed to try to win without making anyone bleed in the paper. In the meantime, we built. We cleared debris down to the slab and painted a white rectangle on the concrete where the Sunday room would be. I stood in the rectangle and practiced speaking to a crowd, my knees too creaky to dance, but my voice still strong enough to keep time. We chalked dots on the floor for outlets, figured heights for rails, measured door swings with the zeal of converts. My son learned to love numbers as if they were commandments that had always been there waiting for him to be ready. He said arc fault like a prayer. On the day the salvage crew found the iron letters that used to hang under the neon, I took it as a benediction. The bracket holding the V was intact. The E was bent. The O, which I already had, was pink and beautiful and foolish. V-O, my son said, laughing for real. We're missing the L and the rest of the promise. Sometimes the missing is the point, I said. We get to write the rest. I ordered a small sign, temporary, to hang on the chain link around the site, future home of the Sunday room. Safety is a love letter. Underneath, a smaller sign in neat block letters, owned by a mother and her son who learned to read permits. People stopped to take photos. A city councilwoman brought coffee to our crew and asked Alma whether she'd considered designing a workshop for other small business owners. Of course, Alma said. We'll call it Plugs and Prayers. Don't promise prayer, I said dryly, and we all laughed the kind of laugh that blesses a day without costing anything. At night, I worked on the exhibit, a small, traveling set of cases for the jewelry and photocopies of the papers that brought them home. Not to scold anyone. To show the math. For each heirloom, a receipt from a buyer who did the right thing, a note from my son about the negotiation, and a tiny card titled What the Law Said and What Love Asked. I called a librarian at the public library who runs a program called Fix It Fridays, and she said, "Bring me a sledgehammer-shaped story, and I will put it in the front atrium." We set a date 2 months out, the day that would mark exactly 1 season since the empty safe. I promised the jewels nothing except careful lighting and a fast return home after each showing. "We are not making you performers," I whispered into the velvet as I packed them into cases. "We are letting you be teachers." 2 weeks before the exhibit, the DA announced charges against the consultant, paper misconduct, improper stamping, contributing to unsafe occupancy. Vega's name was not on that filing, but it didn't need to be. He called my attorney to ask for mediation. We said yes without smiling. Mediation is how grown-ups argue when they're tired of the price of spite. The mediators sat us in a room with bad coffee and a bowl of mints. Vega's lawyer wore a tie that made him look like he was strangling on purpose. We told the story. We put the steakhouse paragraph on the table face up. Vega looked at the paper like it had been written by a better twin he couldn't quite recognize. The mediator steepled his fingers and said, "What is the outcome we can live with?" "Build a fund," I said. $50,000 to start, administered by the city, earmarked for safety upgrades in small clubs. Donate the old light rigs to a community theater. Write a letter to the editor that says, "I pushed, I was wrong, here is how I am helping fix it." And my son gets an apology in the paper where you called him unreliable last summer. "That's a lot of confession," the lawyer said. "That's a lot of oxygen," I said. "Pick which you prefer." They conferred in voices that sounded like money being counted without joy. They said yes to the fund and the donation. They said yes to the letter if they could write it themselves and let the paper edit it. They said nothing about the apology until my son, who had been quiet, put his hand on the paper with the paragraph and said, "If I can write 'I stole from my mother' in ink, you can write 'I pressured a man to open unsafely.'" Vega looked at him like he'd just met him and wasn't sure whether to be afraid or proud. "All right," he said finally. "Yes." We walked out into sunlight. My son stood on the sidewalk and breathed like he was tasting his first day of weather. "I didn't know it would feel like this," he said. "Like what?" "Like work could be a kind of clean." "It is," I said. "You just have to do it long enough for it to sink into your hands." The night before the exhibit, I ironed the tablecloths like I iron prayers, slow, with pressure. I laid out the cases and the cards. I set the opal ring on a tiny stand where the light would find the fire in it without making it nervous. I wore my grandmother's pearls under my sweater, against my skin where they hum when I'm brave. At the library, people came like they do for vaccinations and good gossip, in lines, with the hungry patience of those who want to leave the room better than they found it. Rena set up a tips jar labeled Safety Class Fund, and I matched every dollar with one from the envelope where I keep my things we owe money. A teacher brought her ninth graders, and they made a wall of post-it notes titled What I Will Do Right When I Own Something. The first note said, "Hire an electrician named Alma." I took a photo and texted it to Alma, and she sent back a single sticker of a plug and a heart. During my talk, I said, if you loved it, it deserves a receipt. If you built it, it deserves a permit. If you hurry it, it deserves your apology. No one clapped for a moment because they were listening all the way to the end of the sentence. Then they clapped the way people clap when they're agreeing with themselves. Afterwards, a young man lingered at the case with the watch chain. "I was the one who bought it," he said softly. "I sell vintage online." Your son came at night with cash and a shaking voice. "I thought about keeping it. I didn't. I'm glad I didn't." "You did the right thing at the right time," I said, and it was the pure truth. He looked relieved the way people do when someone older tells them they're not a villain in a story after all. The Sunday room slab cured in the heat, and the first studs went up like a skeleton creaking itself awake. We held a little ceremony with hard hats where we wrote names inside them like the old custom of pinning them in coats. Alma's grandmother, who taught her to count in twos. Rena's brother, who took her to her first concert. My husband, who saved for a ruby. My son wrote the name of a boy he used to be and snapped the hat on his head like a blessing that could be put on and kept. We put a photo of the old club on the construction fence. Not to shame it. To remember what speed looks like when it's painted in neon and wrapped around a bad wire. Next to it we put a list titled, in black marker, the slower list, inspection scheduled, electrician hired, exits unblocked, occupancy true, training dates posted, receipts saved, permits framed on the wall where everyone could point and say, "There." That is what safety looks like when it is proud. One afternoon, Alma called me over to the back corner where the fire had started. "We saved the old junction box," she said. "For class." "What class?" I asked. "The one Rena and I are going to teach on opening day. We'll pass this around and let people feel what wrong feels like in the hand. Then we'll let them touch the right one, the one that clicks into place and doesn't wobble. Your son can talk about remorse that comes too late. You can talk about family that makes you brave enough to take a letter to City Hall." "Plugs and prayers," I said, and she grinned. Exactly. On the night the city council voted to create the Small Business Safety Fund with Vega's money as the seed, we watched on my couch. The council members' faces were squares in a grid, each framed by a home office or a kitchen or a room they didn't want us to see. The vote slid across the bottom of the screen. Yes, 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 yes. My son put his head in his hands, and I let him be a child for exactly 1 minute. Then I nudged his shoulder. "Tomorrow morning, 7 sharp," I said. "We're framing the bathroom corridor." "The bathroom corridor," he repeated, as if saying it correctly could guarantee that wires would be sized right and breakers would trip politely, and the whole place would stack its rules in order and sit with its hands folded. When the meeting ended, I turned off the TV and stood in the quiet. The opal ring winked under the lamp like an old friend teasing you for checking the oven twice. I went to the safe, turned the dial with the care I give to anything that can carry a memory without spilling it, and opened the door. Velvet filled the space like night under a new moon. I touched the pearls, the brooch, the bracelet that squeaked like mice in shoes, the watch chain nicked by a mouth that didn't know how else to be brave. I whispered the names of everyone who had worn them and the names of everyone who had helped return them, and for the first time since the emptiness had edged me like a cliff, I felt the shape of a landing. "Tomorrow," I told the jewels, "you have to go teach again. And then you can rest." The next morning, I beat my son to the site by 10 minutes and lined the studs with little squares of paper. On each I had written one line: "We measure twice. We wire right. We label. We keep exits friendly. We do not lie to ourselves about luck. We do not call speed a plan. We put the permit where we can see it, and so can anyone else. He read them like commandments and didn't joke once. That was how I knew we were almost ready for the last hard part, opening day. The one that would test whether a woman can rebuild a place where a mistake had once tried to eat everything alive and make it safe enough for other women to bring their babies to hear live music on a Sunday afternoon. We weren't at the end yet, but we were close enough to smell fresh paint. And once you've smelled fresh paint after smoke, you do not forget the difference. I asked the judge for a sentence people could dance to, and by dusk we plugged in the pink O without the room catching fire. My son stood beside me with a broom and a building code manual, and the only thing smoking was the brisket a neighbor brought to say, "We see what you built from your worst day." Court first, because endings worth keeping have paperwork. The DA's office set the hearing for a Tuesday morning when the courthouse smelled like rubber soles and old coffee. My son wore the suit he'd bought when he still believed a sharp crease could hide a shortcut. He'd returned every piece, cashed out his house, and carried his shame with both hands. He wasn't asking to be excused. He was asking to be useful. "Mrs. Dorthy," the judge said, peering over her glasses. "You asked to be heard." I stepped to the lectern with my notes folded in my palm like a church bulletin. "Your Honor," I said, "I called the police the night my safe went empty because I needed the state to believe me. I'm here now because I need the state to help me believe in what comes next. My son stole our family's past. He gave it back. He burned his future down. He's been helping me build one for other people with exits that don't lie. I'm asking for a sentence that makes that work permanent." "What are you proposing?" she asked, voice neutral but kind. "Restitution is complete," I said. "I propose community service tied to exactly what he harmed, for 100 hours of safety education and build-out on the Sunday room. A requirement to complete certified fire safety manager training. A year of probation with surprise inspections from the city's code office. If he slips, you hold him. If he doesn't, you expunge this from his record so he can earn without selling speed ever again." The courtroom air went still in that way people get when something clicks onto the right track. The DA nodded. My son didn't look at me. He looked at the judge like the first honest thing all year might actually stick to the wall. The judge leaned back. "Full restitution. Documented. No injuries in the fire, by grace and luck. Substantial community harm, mitigated by substantial community repair. I'll take the proposal, with additions." My stomach tightened, but she continued, "Monthly reports to this court from a licensed electrician confirming compliance on any site he touches. A public talk once a quarter with the city library on what shortcuts cost. No guns, no drinking, no nightlife ownership until probation ends. And an apology, not just to your mother, Mr. Hollis, but to the people who stood in your club and trusted you with their breath." "Yes, Your Honor," my son said, voice steady. "All of it." "Then I'll accept diversion," she ruled. "Felony theft held in abeyance. Misdemeanor trespass and property crime entered. If you complete everything, I'll vacate the theft and reduce the rest to a citation. If you don't, we'll finish what we started when your mother called 911. The gavel sounded like a door that had been stuck for months finding its hinge again. We walked out into sun that felt wider than the street deserved. My son stopped on the steps, eyes closed. "That sounded like oxygen," he whispered. "It is," I said. "Now we earn it." Earn it we did. In the mornings, studs rose clean and square. At noon, Alma gave toolbox talks that made numbers feel like neighbors, voltage like manners, load like patience, breaker like a friend saying, "Sit down before you fall." In the afternoons, my son and Rena measured aisles with tape stretched tight as a violin string, chalking exit arrows on the slab so the idea sank into their feet. At night he studied for the fire safety course, saying aloud phrases that had once only lived in other people's mouths. Egress width, impacity, class A foam, occupant load. He wrote them on index cards and rubber-banded them like a second chance. Meanwhile, the other half of justice quietly put on its shoes. The consultant accepted a consent order, 6 months suspension from stamping, mandatory training, public censure that read like a scar you could point to when someone tried to hand you a stamp, just to hold us over. Vega, who had signed a steakhouse confession between a martini and whatever men like him order when they're trying not to look cornered, funded the city's small venue safety grant with a check big enough to make other men ask whether there would be a plaque. There wasn't. The council named the fund for an elementary school teacher who'd once taped glow sticks along a school auditorium floor during a blackout and then stayed late to help clean. That was better credit anyway. He also wrote the letter to the editor. The paper ran it on a Thursday above the fold. I pushed a business to open before it was safe. It was wrong. I'm paying to fix what I broke. No excuses. I read it twice. Then I used it as a handout in Alma's class and made Rena tape it above the mop sink. We announced the opening of the Sunday room with flyers that looked like invitations to a neighborhood wedding. Simple type, no neon, a line at the bottom that read, "Safety is a love letter." The city issued our actual occupancy certificate, ink wet, dates correct, seals shining. We framed it next to the restroom because all roads lead past the proof. Opening day smelled like new paint and coffee. The ribbon was a length of caution tape because symbolism is only smug when it doesn't earn its punchline. The fire inspector, who'd been gruff in the early days and kinder as our studs stood straight, handed my son the scissors. My son shook his head and passed them to me. "You called the police," he said. "You cut it." "I called the police because I love you," I said quietly, and the crowd shuffled because some sentences make people feel like they should have brought a casserole. I lifted the scissors. The tape parted with a whisper and the room breathed. We stepped inside together. The pink O rescued, rewired, humbled, hung over the back wall glowing like morning. The old iron letters we'd found in the rubble spelled something new, Sunday. The missing letters didn't matter. We'd cut the others fresh, honest metal bolted to honest brackets. There were no black corners for wires to hide in. Exit signs didn't blink, they beamed. The bar was now a coffee counter flanked by 2 water dispensers labeled with jokes Rena loved, hydration station, and what your future self will thank you for. On the floor, a white rectangle showed the dance area, taped off with edges that said, "Here is where you do the loud thing you love without hurting anyone." We started with a safety class. People filled folding chairs like congregants who trusted their preacher because she wore steel-toed boots. Alma held up the old junction box in a clear case. "This is what wrong feels like in the hand," she said. "It's light when it should be heavy, loose when it should be tight, bargain when it should be backbone." She passed it along the rows. My son followed with the new box, weighty and proper, the plate clicking on with a satisfaction that made people murmur. "That sound," he said, "is what peace feels like when it's not pretending." Then we danced. Not the sweaty midnight kind. The kind with hands on small shoulders and toes carefully out of the way. Babies in slings. For teenagers trying to invent a step and pretending they weren't practicing something like hope. Rena cried near the espresso machine and said, "Shut up, I saw dust," to anyone who noticed. Midway through, I slipped away to the small gallery we'd built off the lobby. The cases were low enough for children and high enough for thieves to have to work too hard. Inside, my grandmother's pearls gleamed like someone had polished a moon. The ruby winked without flirting. The Art Deco bracelet sat on its little stand ready to squeak if I shook it, which I didn't. A card next to each piece told the short version, and under it, a second card titled what the law said and what love asked. Strangers read and nodded. A girl pressed her fingers to the glass and whispered, "My grandma has a brooch. I'm going to ask her to tell me who gave it to her." Mary and Tom, our docents trained at church fish fries the way I'd promised, watched with the kind of alert kindness that keeps hands where they belong without making anyone feel like a suspect. On the far wall, a framed photocopy of the police report hung next to a photo of the filled safe and a copy of the judge's order. The caption read, "A system that believes you, a family that holds you, a city that learns, this is how we keep what we love." At noon, we held the second class, Plugs and Prayers. Rena opened with a story about a night when a power hiccup turned music to static and panic to a flavor in your mouth. Alma explained why a thicker wire is a kind of generosity. My son said into a microphone I told myself I would fix it before my mother noticed. No one has ever beaten the clock that way. If you hear yourself whispering that plan, stop. Call an adult you respect. If you don't know one, call here. After the class, people milled. The fire inspector stood near the coffee and blinked too often. You did good, she said to my son in a voice that tried to be casual and failed. Keep doing it. I don't want to visit here on the wrong kind of day. You won't, he said. It would break my mother, and I am done breaking my mother. Someone clapped, then everyone did. It wasn't for the clever of it. It was for the sound of a man knowing the size of promise he can keep. The newspaper sent a photographer, the library sent a banner, and an electrician from the next county sent an email asking for Alma's slides. The councilwoman who'd brought coffee to our crew read a proclamation that made me blush, a thank you for building a place where codes were not a scold but a choir. I accepted with my hands the way you take a cake you didn't bake, grateful, a little embarrassed, intent on sharing it. The week after opening, I went to the pawn shop where the bracelet had first been sold. I stood at the case and said to the owner, "You called the police when you could have kept your head down." He shrugged, flesh creeping up his neck. "I got a mother," he said. "She would have haunted me." "I hope she does anyway," I said. "Haunt you into calling again if anyone brings you a story that tastes like desperation." He promised. I believed him. Some men do better when they can point to a day they did the right thing under bright lights. Life became a calendar dotted with honest verbs: plaster, file, teach, sweep, sign, tune, open, close, rest. My son passed his fire safety manager exam. He taped the certificate inside a cabinet because he said the wall should belong to art and permits. He did his hours. He taught his talks. He sat in the library's community room and said to 50 people eating store cookies, "Here's my wrong in bullet points. Here's how to make your right heavier." The civil case settled in mediation. No theatrics. Just numbers stacked into shape, more money for the fund, a year of free inspections for small venues that asked nicely and promised to fix what was found. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like we'd closed the loop on a lesson with enough ink to last. On a quiet Tuesday, the judge signed the order vacating the theft count. The clerk stamped it with the same thud that had introduced me to paper months before. My son folded the order and put it in his wallet next to a photo of the Sunday room at dusk and a card with my rules from the refrigerator: shrunk to fit, clean up, call, no money talk after 9, quick update at breakfast. He still lives in my guest room, by choice now, while he saves for a small place with decent wiring and a landlord who returns texts. As for the jewels, they go out for a few hours at a time on school days and return home before supper like teenagers with curfews that keep the world from becoming heavier than it needs to be. I wrote their future in my will, one piece per child per generation, as we've always done, but held in a small family trust with a stubborn clause: may not be sold, may be exhibited for education with a grandmother's permission. Must come home for Christmas and the first week of June, the month my husband was born. The trust has a note attached, not legally binding but plainer than law. If you are in a room where you must choose between speed and safety, remember this ring on my finger and choose the thing that lets a person breathe. On the first Sunday of fall, we hung a small bronze plaque by the door because people kept asking for something to touch before they left. You are safe here because people loved you before you arrived. We watched a toddler slap her palm onto it and giggle. Rena leaned over the counter and whispered to me, "That's the sound I want to hear every Sunday." "Me too," I said. "Every time." A month later, the library took our exhibit on a small tour: 2 churches, a high school gym, the Union Hall where electricians play bingo on Thursdays. In each place, someone came up after and told me about a family object, a corner they wanted to unlearn, a son who hadn't called and then did. I put their stories in a notebook labeled Things We Love and Things We Owe because my husband's penciled block letters still know how to organize a life. One evening when the air smelled like leaves thinking about letting go, my son came home late from a site check. He knocked on my bedroom door like a man who has learned not to barge into other people's quiet. "You awake?" he whispered. "I am now." He stood in the doorway with a look I'd only seen a few times, the kind a boy wears after he's made the right choice when no one was watching him. "The owner wanted to open Friday," he said. "We're not ready." I told him no. I told him to look at the wires like they were somebody's lungs. He yelled, Then he apologized. We're opening next week. I patted the bed beside me and he sat, careful, like he was still a guest in a miracle. That was costly, I said. It was clean, he said. And I slept in the car for 20 minutes after because I was proud and I didn't know what else to do with it. We laughed very quietly because pride that doesn't shout is the kind you can live with. A year to the week after my safe gaped at me like a cliff edge, I put the opal ring back on to bake lemon bars. I stirred and zest and watched the fire in the stone behave itself like a promise kept. After supper, I carried the ring to the bedroom closet, turned the dial, and opened the safe. Velvet greeted me the way a forest does when you step under it, soft, holding full. I set the ring down where it belongs and listened to the click of the latch finding home. Then I went to my calendar and wrote in pen, Sunday room, family dance, 2 p.m., Alma's class at noon, Rena's coffee cake. Under it, I wrote a second line, smaller, call the inspector just to say thank you. Because not every phone call has to break your heart. Some can put it back exactly where you want it, beating steady in a room you built slow on purpose. People still ask whether I forgave my son. I tell them forgiveness is too small a word for what we made with our hands. We built safety where a lie had lived. We nailed apology to stud and ran wire through it. We let other people dance on top of our paperwork. If you need a shorter answer, here it is. He stole the past, he returned it piece by piece, and then he helped me build a future that can hold strangers. We're even in the only way that matters. When I lock the door at night, I stand for a minute and listen. The building hums not with fear, but with the friendly buzz of circuits that know their job. Somewhere on a shelf, the pink rests until tomorrow, its light soft and honest. I think about the first emptiness that had edges, the first breath that went to paper, the first letter that made a man admit to speed, the first stud that stood without leaning, the first song we played that didn't have to out trouble. Then I turn out the lights and go to bed, unafraid of the dark, because I finally understand what it means to own the night, not with neon, not with noise, but with a room where the exit signs are brighter than the stage and no one has to run to be safe. That is the revenge I wanted and the peace I got.
Your watch to the end. Be click here. You will hear another story from my grandma.